let's get started. We don't have a speaker yet, but he says he's almost there, and it's an old song that I know is almost there, living on a prayer. So he's going to be with us later today, and one of the things I believe he's going to talk about is school openings. And I have through Open Public Records Acts received something that occurred in August 27th, back and forth between the local Department of Health and our county council. Maybe some of you heard it or seen it. And it's Erica Lautenbach is reporting to the county council, and she talks a little bit about testing and how they're going to test one of the housing developments that have immigrants or workers. And then she talks about a conversation with the State Department of Health. And she says, this afternoon, I had a good conversation with DOH Secretary John Wiseman and State Health Officer Kathy Laffey. I shared that with the indefinite pause on phase progression, our communities have lost an anchor and a strategy goal to achieve. No kidding. Many of the businesses that were in phase 3 are now able to operate with restrictions, but there is still confusion about where we're headed and what happens when we, as we did yesterday, reach below the 25 per 100K threshold. Both John and Kathy, those are the two officials at the state level, feel strongly that we can't move forward until we, counties, are able to open schools safely and see sustained low rates. We have continued to work with school superintendents and will revisit the strategy in 8 or 9 weeks in preparation for the start of a new quarter. Then they go on to talk about WWU. One of the reasons that I bring this up is it enters heavily into a decision process of any school board that's out there. What has happened in Whatcom County is the health department has recommended that you do not have in-person classes. So schools and boards wanted to vote on whether they wanted to follow that recommendation. And there was a little bit of disagreement here and there. Well, after that particular proclamation, the insurance consortiums came on board. And the insurance consortiums in a school district are those that basically pay the bills for being sued and pay the bills for accidents on campus and those kind of issues. They recommended or told school board members that they thought that if they opened and did in-person learning, that in fact there would be a problem in being sued for God knows what down the road, and they recommended highly against in-person learning. Now, as a former school board member, my wife and I served for 20 years. When you hear something like that from your insurance consortium, and they will charge and increase the insurance rates, which means kids don't get taught, you generally take their advice. And upon their advice, most school districts in Whatcom County remain closed. What bothers me, and of course bothers all of us, is the attitude that this can just go on and on. We heard, you'll maybe hear from the superintendent today, that there was a story on the OSPI person was asked whether he thought that we would be in phase 4 by September and October, and his response basically was there's probably going to be nothing open until next year. So
the governor has frozen the phases.
Right.
I don't anticipate that unfreezing before the election.
Right. So we're out of school until, like they say, the next 8 or 9 weeks as far as in-person training. And the superintendent's going to be talking about that, I hope. He's not already here.
He's on.
He's on.
It's Larry, right?
Larry Francois.
I'm here, Charlie.
Oh, you're great. Well, what I'll do is I'll do my intro to Larry and let him talk, because I'm tired of me. Okay.
All right.
So here we are. Let me do a little intro. So as I said, my wife and I had served on the local school board for 20 years, Meridian School District. And our greatest accomplishment was the fact that we were able to pass a bond issue to build a new high school and grade school by a large plurality of the people in a very conservative fiscal district. During that time, I was active in other things as well, and I was appointed in 2016 to something called the ESD, which stands for Educational Service District. And it's a 9-member board that's based out of Anacortes. There are 9 ESDs, Educational Service Districts, in Washington State. In our case, we cover 35 different school districts. And our presenter, Larry, will talk about the structure and the goals in his presentation, I hope. Like I said, I was appointed to the board in 2016. At that time, the other board members voted for me, and I've been reelected by school board members since then. I think the people here today will be interested in the fact of the way that the ESD works and the way that they're funded. It's a little bit different than most government agencies that have to do with education for certain, if not everywhere else. Larry Francois is the current superintendent in Northwest ESD 189. He was hired in July 2016, so I got in on that interview. And he has had 23 years of leadership experience, including 13 years as a superintendent in Lakewood School District, which had 2,300 students, and the North Shore District, which was a little different, had 22,000 students and 33 schools. Larry is a young 55-year-old and the youngest of, I believe, 9 siblings. Was it more or less, Larry?
12.
12, sorry.
I have 11 brothers and sisters. There's 12 of us altogether.
And I don't know if he's had time lately, but he's a guitar player in a classic rock band called, of all things, Crisis. Lately, he's been helping to manage the revolutionary changes coming to education because of COVID. And he's here today to speak about that and hopefully answer our questions about when public schools will face students again and on his insights on education in the post-COVID world. Here's Larry Francois.
All right. Thanks, Charlie.
Lots of applause. Yes.
All right. It's good to be with everybody today. And excuse me for trying to munch on a couple of bites of a protein bar. I was over in San Juan Island meeting with the new superintendent over there. So I just got back into the office. So I kind of caught a little bit of what Charlie said, so I'll probably do a little bit of repeating. But I think I'll start sort of where Charlie ended, which is maybe what are ESDs, were these educational service districts, and how do they fit into the statewide system? We're a bit of a kind of an unknown entity. So across Washington State, there are a total of 295 school districts, the majority of which are small rural school districts. All of those 295 school districts are geographically grouped into what are called educational service districts. And as Charlie said, the Northwest Educational Service District encompasses the 5 counties of Snohomish, Skagit, Whatcom, Island, and San Juan, and about 35 school districts, not about, 35 school districts in those counties, about 170,000 students. We also support tribal compact schools like the Lummi Nation School as well. ESDs are really an outgrowth of sort of decades of consolidation in Washington State. So if you go back into the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, there weren't 295 school districts in Washington State. There were over 2,000 school districts in Washington State. And oftentimes it was confusing for folks to know exactly what school district they belonged to, exactly what school district they were paying taxes in, et cetera. And so as part of the structure at the time, each county in the state had a superintendent who then sort of managed all of the workings of the individual school districts within those counties. And then over time, school districts were slowly consolidated. For instance, when I was in North Shore, North Shore is a composition of what used to be, I can't remember the exact number, 9 or 13 small school districts that then over time into the 1950s finally got consolidated into its current form. So with those consolidations, eventually some of those county offices of the superintendent were also consolidated. And each ESD is associated with a number. So in our case, our number is 189. So the last consolidation that took place about 52 years ago, there was a region 108, which was primarily Snohomish County. And then there was a region 109, which was the other 4 counties in our region, Skagit, Whatcom Island, and San Juan. Those were then consolidated further into our current ESD structure. And so we took the 108 and the 109 and we became ESD 189. And each ESD's number has a similar story behind it as to how they came into being. Some of them are numbers that were combined like ours. Some of them there's math involved. Some of them there's, you know, different kinds of gyrations as to how they got with their numbers. 101, 114, 113, 123, 112, etc. So that's kind of the history of the ESDs. As Charlie mentioned, we do have an elected board. In our case, we have a 9-member board. 2 of the 9 ESDs have 9-member boards. 7 of the 9 ESDs have 7-member boards. Our boards are elected by the elected school board members in the 35 school districts. So they're not direct ballot elections, but they're more elected by the elected school board members in those districts. Our statutory charge is really to assist the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction and the State Board of Education in the fulfillment of their statutory responsibilities. Our other charge is to provide cooperative and informational services as requested by school districts. So we have some things that we are required to do. We do fiscal monitoring of school districts, monitoring their budgets, their financial positions. If a school district ever got into a fiscal trouble, they would enter into a contract with OSPI that's called binding conditions. Basically, here are the things that you are going to do, school district, to get out of fiscal trouble. And then we as the ESD would monitor and enforce that contract, that agreement between that school district and OSPI. We have occasionally border disputes between school districts. You know, usually it involves housing that is developed where there didn't used to be housing, and whoever lives in that housing thinks it makes more sense for them to belong to this school district than to that school district. If districts can't resolve those issues between themselves, then we step in and we would make that that decision. The other kind of small area that I'm involved in, fortunately doesn't come up too very often, but professional conduct issues. So if principals or teachers or other folks who have state certification are in violation of the Code of Professional Conduct, I might get involved in investigating complaints around those particular issues. So those are kind of the things that we're legally required to do. Most of what we do is provide services, as our name suggests, educational service district. So we provide literally dozens and dozens of services on either a cooperative or a fee-for basis to the 35 school districts in our region. And I'll just give you some examples of those. So we operate the juvenile detention educational programs in Whatcom County, Skagit County, and Snohomish County. It's more efficient and effective for us to do that on behalf of the districts in those counties than to have a single district or the districts combined on their own to provide those services. Similarly, we operate 3 programs also in Whatcom, Skagit, and Snohomish County for some of the most significantly impacted students with behavioral issues. So if you're a smaller district and you have one such student, you could be looking at potentially, you know, a couple $100,000 to develop an appropriate program and staff an appropriate program for that one student. Districts instead contract with us. We run 3 central locations where we sort of try and leverage the economy of scale of bringing together multiple districts who have needs to serve those kinds of students. We do fingerprinting. We do technology supports to districts. We deploy drug and alcohol counselors out in school districts. We do a lot of professional development and training of teachers and other staff. We provide threat assessment services for school districts. It's kind of a long list of all the things that we do. I know you can't see this and I don't have this electronically, but this is a matrix we produce every year. Actually, I do have this electronically that I can screen share. So these are the 35 school districts that we support up here at the top. Each year, as we do our annual report, we go back and list all the services that we have available in all of our various divisions, and you can see what some of those are. And then we note which school districts participate in which of those services. So some services like fingerprinting, all school districts participate in. Other services like we run a legal services cooperative. So we contract with a legal firm that provides legal services to member school districts. And we have 7 school districts that belong to that. Suicide prevention, Open Doors, that's a dropout retrieval program. We operate that program for 2 school districts. We do traffic safety education in 2 school districts. So the biggest source of our revenue really are these cooperative programs. As Charlie mentioned, we're funded differently than school districts across the state that are primarily funded based on the number of students that they serve. With very few exceptions, we don't do direct services of students. So what you would consider sort of the equivalent of the funding that school districts receive for, in our case, is about $800,000 a year. So that's what we get to run our office, meet our statutory obligations, and that's sort of the unencumbered money that we get, which doesn't go very far, you know, in an organization of 225 employees. So the rest of our funding really comes through fee for services. So things that school districts pay us to do on their behalf. They come through grants that we secure. They come through contracts that we may enter into with both the state of Washington or the federal government. So it's pretty varied, but again, these cooperative programs, these cooperative services where groups of districts band together and find it more efficient for us to provide services on their behalf. That's our single largest source of income. We have about, as I said, 225 employees. About a quarter of them work here out of our central location in Anacortes, and the other 2/3 of them are deployed across the 5-county region. In either the cooperative programs I mentioned, or they might be working directly in schools in some capacity. So that's a little bit about the ESD. Again, we're kind of unknown in the K-12 world, but I think we play an important role, and we play a particularly important role for smaller districts that we really step into the space of providing them expertise and capacity that it might be not cost effective or efficient for them to provide on their own. So that's what we do. When the pandemic hit, just kind of a little bit of what we did as an ESD and what ESDs across the state did. Like everybody else, I think we were pretty caught off guard at the speed with which the pandemic developed, and we, you know, entered into a school closure order issued by the governor. We really went into help mode with school districts. So as a collection of 9 ESDs, we have been, since April, providing training for school districts on how to effectively teach remotely. And so we have done several series of training sessions for teachers across the state. We've trained thousands and thousands of teachers really in 4 areas. So one is, what's the learning management system that a district's going to use? So you might have heard of things like Google Classroom or Canvas or Seesaw or Schoology. There's a number of platforms that are out there. But there wasn't a lot of expertise in those platforms because most teaching was happening in person in schools with kids. So we were training on that. We were training on synchronous ways to provide instruction. So what we're all on here is Zoom. This is a synchronous tool that can be used for instruction. It's happening in real time. We've been training on asynchronous tools for instruction. So how can I, as a teacher, record a lesson and then make it available to students either to access at a later time or to access on demand. And then finally, we've been helping advise districts around storage. So as everything's done remotely now, work between teachers and kids and families need to be exchanged back and forth. How do you do that? Where, you know, are you doing that through primarily through the cloud, but there's several vehicles that are available for folks to do that. So that's the training we've been involved in. And then over the summer, the Superintendent of Public Instruction really looked to the ESDs to take a lead role providing learning management system training for school districts. And this was part of the Superintendent of Public Instruction's desire that districts land on one system that is common to all teachers within their district, or at least to most teachers within their district. And the reason for that is that parents were finding themselves, depending on which teacher their child might be with, they were in one system with this teacher, they were in another system with this teacher, and they were in a third system with that teacher. And it was really difficult for parents to manage. And so we've really tried to kind of consolidate that and hone that a little bit so that it's more manageable. The remote learning situation is more manageable for families. So we're continuing that training into the fall. We're adding another component that will help train districts to train their parents how to effectively help kids navigate remote learning. So that's the primary way that we've been involved. Sort of the secondary way is that I convene the 35 superintendents of our region every week, where actually we meet Wednesday afternoons at 3 o'clock via Zoom. And it's just been a way for everybody to stay in contact with one another, keep informed about what districts are doing, what they're thinking, what their plans are. And then similarly, my assistant superintendent for teaching and learning has been doing weekly meetings with her counterparts on the instructional side. And my assistant superintendent for fiscal operations has been doing the same with all the fiscal folks. And it's just been a really complicated environment. There have been dozens and dozens of guidance documents on a host of topics that have come from the Department of Health, from OSPI, from the Federal Department of Education. So just helping school districts keep up with the fire hose of all that information has really been a key part of the services we've been focused on over the last 6 months. As Charlie mentioned, I don't know if he mentioned it or not, but districts were struggling just to get through the school year. And then just as the school year was wrapping up on on about June 12th, OSPI issued what they called their reopening guidance for next year. So what were the rules of the road going to be for school districts to return to in-person instruction in the fall? And that took the form of this document, which I won't reference all of it, but I'll just notice it's a 58-page document. And kind of scroll through it, you can see sort of in the table of contents all the things that it talked about, how to schedule, implementation steps, health and safety requirements for employees, etc. So this was a document that OSPI produced, but it was heavily influenced by both the Department of Health as well as the Department of Labor and Industries. Once schools districts received this document, they all began planning for this fall. And I would say that up through the 4th of July, the week after the 4th of July, every district in our region was planning to return to some level of in-person instruction for kids. It may not have necessarily been all kids in school every day, but it would at least have been maybe 50% of the students on on one day, 50% on another day, some kind of rotational A/B schedule. And then something, I guess not so mysterious, but something happened really in that week after the 4th of July. And if you think back to that time, that was when COVID-19 cases in the South, Florida, Texas, Arizona, California were really starting to accelerate. And that was following both the Memorial Day weekend as well as the July 4th holiday. And so our state followed suit, and while we had declining cases at that point in time, cases across the state began to take off again. And so over the next several weeks, there was a significant change in public sentiment in districts about their interest or their comfort in returning kids to in-person instruction. Districts were doing all kinds of surveying of families and staff at that time to sort of understand who would be interested in coming back to school, who would not be interested in coming back to school, what employees had health conditions that put them at high risk. They were doing all kinds of surveying. So they were getting this change in sentiment after that week following the 4th of July, where it really went from, you know, most people were interested in coming back to some level of in-person instruction to very much that became a minority view. So that really put districts in a tough spot because, you know, the clock is ticking. They really had about 6 or 7 weeks at that point to start planning for the new school year. So as the month progressed, many of the county health officers began to weigh in. And as Charlie indicated, many of them, including those in our region, were actively discouraging schools from resuming in-person instruction at that time because cases were on the upswing. So that put schools into a whole new planning mode. Most of the work that they had been engaged in over the last month or 6 weeks really, they really had to pivot very quickly to start thinking of a different model of reopening schools in the fall. And then, as Charlie mentioned, kind of to add to the layer of complication for school boards and superintendents, there are 2 primary insurance carriers that cover school districts in Washington State, and both of them came out together and said, you know, we're here to cover you. You still have your errors and omissions coverage and your liability coverage, but just know if you do something that's dramatically different than what your county health officer is recommending, you could be subject to a claim of deliberate indifference, in which case, depending on the facts of that particular case, your insurance coverage may be null and void. And so that obviously played into the calculus of school districts and superintendents as they began to make decisions to go back to opening schools primarily remotely in the fall. What we of course have then seen in recent weeks is that cases have began to improve again, which is really a positive thing. And we are just coming off a holiday weekend, and so if the last 2 holidays, Memorial Day and 4th of July, are any indication, we may see another surge, another upswing, small or large, coming in the next coming week. So that remains to be seen at this point. But as more districts began to go remotely, they also were asking the state for guidance on what would be the metrics that would determine that it's safe for resuming in-person instruction. And so from that, the Department of Health with OSPI and the governor's office produced this decision-making tree, which I will find here. This came out earlier in the summer. It was just updated on August 31st. If you can see the date here. I won't go through it. I'll just point out a couple of things here. So this is looking at data as of July 23rd, 2020. And so they looked at a number of countries that had opened themselves up to in-person instruction already to see what their experience had been, and also to see what their case counts were. And so you can see, just kind of focusing on this last column here, which is the estimated number of cases per 100,000 people in the last 14 days, you can see that at the end of July, our country and our state were significantly above where nearly all of these other countries had been as far as their overall infection rates. And so that was kind of the lay of the land in late July, first part of August, as districts were having to make these decisions to move to a remote learning environment for this fall. What they then produced with this document is what they're calling this decision-making tree. So this is intended to apply to all public and private schools in Washington State, and is to help guide them and guide their public health officials as to when and at what levels it's safe to bring students back for in-person instruction. So if you can see over here, looking at the far left of the screen, the model is essentially divided into three tiers: a low risk, a moderate risk, and a high risk. So high risk, and that's where many districts were, or many communities were, in late July and the first part of August, is when there are over 75 cases per day per 100,000 students over the last 14 days. And then they have other considerations that districts and health officials should think about as they try and interpret that number. And primarily, what's the trend in the cases? Are they going up or are they going down? And in, again, late July, early August, they were going up. And so this, different from the governor's order to close schools in the spring, this is not an order, these are just recommendations. But the recommendation, when you're in the high category, is it's strongly recommended that there be distance learning. And perhaps some options for limited in-person learning in small groups or cohorts. And so those could be your most highly impacted special needs kids who really aren't appropriate to be educated in remote learning settings, etc. So, and then they also added to their recommendations about extracurricular activities. So again, strongly recommending canceling or postponing. What's happening now is that most communities in our region are now dropping back into the moderate range. So cases have been coming down. And so when you get into the moderate range, the recommendation is to continue with distance learning, but to look at expanding possibly to elementary students. So many districts in our region already have plans to start reintroducing kindergartners, perhaps first grade students, in perhaps as late this month or into October. Other districts have said that they'll revisit after 9 weeks, maybe at the end of the first quarter of the school year. And then the third tier is the low risk case, and so that's when there's less than 25 cases per 100,000 students over 14 days. And that's where the guidance encourages full-time in-person learning for all elementary students, and a hybrid, so some combination of in-person and remote for secondary students. So this is kind of the general framework that has been provided to districts to help guide them on when they should be thinking about bringing students back to school. And then kind of as you move to the right here, they have a list of sort of the health and safety requirements that districts must be able to address if and when they contemplate bringing students back for in-person instruction. So there are all kinds of more detailed guidance documents that are behind all of these items here, but it's everything from, can you safely transport students? Can you group students so that they're in similar groups of kids or the same group of kids every single day, so that in the event you do get an infection, it in theory would be limited just to that exposure would be limited just to that group of students.
Larry,
Can
can I ask you a quick question? Sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt.
No.
Something important relative to this number of cases occurred in the last couple of months that I don't think has been taken into account. And that is when these criteria were set up for the 25 to advance in phases, that was based upon general population testing. And we have always been below that 25 number. What changed is that we started doing contact tracing. And whenever anybody had a positive test result, the health department is going after everybody that they've come in contact with, their family, coworkers, people they went to a party with, etc. And they're doing directed testing of individuals. So the number of cases jumped substantially from what was below the 25 level consistently into a much higher level, 50, 60 per week. And then when we did the community-wide large-scale testing where they opened up the Civic Field parking lot, they let anybody come and be tested that wanted to be tested, we again showed that our ratio of positive test results is way below the 25 level. It's only above the 25 level when they artifactually are making the rate elevated, I think for political purposes, by adding in the contact tracing data into the general population data. Does that make sense?
It does. If sort of the basic message is the more you test, the more positivity you're going to show.
Not true. The more you test, the more positivity you'll show. It's the more you test directed individuals, the more positivity you'll show. When we did wide scale testing, it was in the thousands of people who showed up who believed that they had a reason to be tested.
Right.
The ratio was low, not high.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's when you add in directed testing, you get somebody who is positive, the people that they come in contact with is going to be above that baseline number, and it's going to skew your data.
Well, you know, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm a superintendent, so I don't know necessarily how to respond to that, other than I think I would just say that the framework is the framework that districts were given to work with. You know, it's the framework that the health departments, the county health departments, are using to help advise districts. And so,
it's because the governor and the state health department have dictated it to be that way. Can I ask one more clarifying question, and I'll stop interrupting you? And that is, do you have any actual power to enforce that the individual school districts follow your recommendations, or are you there only in a support capacity?
you mean me personally, the ESD?
The ESD.
Yeah, no, we have no ability, no authority to direct school districts to take any particular action one way or another.
Okay.
So we are really there just in a support capacity to school districts.
Okay, got it. Thank
Yep.
you. I'm sorry
Yep.
to interrupt, but I think
No
it's a
problem.
really important point on, we're not being allowed to advance in phases completely artificially.
Yeah, so I'm gonna come back to those metrics in just a second here. Again, reading this, what they're calling this flow chart or this decision tree, you kind of assess where you are in the low, moderate, high range, and then, if you're contemplating in-person instruction, can you address all of these health and safety factors? And then finally, if you can address all of these health and safety factors, then it has to be a partnership between the local school district and public health. And so you can see here these questions, these guiding questions. I would say the first 3 of them are really specific to schools. So can the school ensure monitoring of symptoms? Many are doing that through online attestations that families are planning on doing those through online attestations that families and staff would complete every morning, certifying that they don't have a fever, they don't have symptoms, etc., and then getting a kind of an online okay to come to school or come to work. And then the bottom ones here are really more public health related. So from public health perspective, is there adequate testing capacity in the community? Does the health department have sufficient bandwidth to do contact tracing? And then is the local health department capable of monitoring the level of community spread in their particular county? And so when you sort of move from left to right and then move from top to bottom, this is when you get to this place when you can answer yes to all of these questions. This is where this guidance, this framework says it would be safe to begin in-person learning. So that's kind of the framework that districts have been working within. Again, this came out probably, I want to say the first time districts saw this was probably the first part of August, I think is when it came out originally. And then, as I said, it was just recently updated on August 31st. So this is kind of the roadmap that districts and county health departments have been operating under. And you know, in your county, up in Whatcom County, your health officer did come out with a strong recommendation that districts not begin in-person instruction and that they begin remotely. And that really changed the thinking for most of the districts in that county who were, I think all of them, planning some level of in-person instruction to start the school year. So I'm not sure what's happening in Whatcom County with the health officer there, but I can share that I was on a call with Snohomish County Superintendent and the Snohomish County health officer yesterday. And the health officer there, Dr. Spitters, is contemplating revising his guidance to suggest that in the coming weeks, he thinks it is time to start contemplating bringing back at least small groups of students. And that could be, again, special needs students who really don't do well in a remote learning environment. It could mean starting to bring back kindergartners in some kind of rotational schedule, or young elementary age students. And the reason for the younger students being the priority is, you know, some of it's just common sense. They probably are less adaptable to remote learning and being on devices. I know I've got my own granddaughter is starting kindergarten this year with her Chromebook, and I'll be curious to see how that goes, because I have my doubts. But it's also because those groupings of kids are easier to group together than secondary students. So you can have a group of kindergartners and keep them together all day, every day for all of their instruction. When you get up into secondary, particularly up into the higher grades in high school, students take coursework based on their interests or their level. So just because you're in 10th grade, you might be in trigonometry or you might be in algebra. You know, it's harder to keep folks separated in the same way that it's easier to do in elementary. And then, of course, there's just the disease and infection data, which seems to suggest that the younger students either are less susceptible to contract COVID or don't develop symptoms in the same way that older folks do, et cetera. So that's sort of the rationale of moving forward with the elementary age folks. I don't know if all of you have seen this, but I thought I'd go ahead and share it. So this is the risk assessment dashboard that the Washington State Department of Health and the governor have put together. So this looks at those key metrics that are driving what phases counties are in. So you can kind of go to this main page here, and you can see a color-coded map that shows the phases that counties are in. There are 17 counties that are in phase 3, 17 in phase 2, 5 that are still in phase 1, and then no counties that are in phase 4. And of course, moving from one phase to another has been frozen for about a month or so. But you can look at these 5 metrics and you can see that statewide, we are meeting 2 of the metrics, and we are not meeting the other 2 of the metrics. But you can also go here and pull down and look at any particular county. And so let's just take a look here at, say, Whatcom County. And you can see in Whatcom County, again, they're meeting.
That's not anywhere near today's numbers. Today, I have today's numbers in front of me, and we're 28.9 the rate per 100,000. So that's saying September 6th. I'm looking at September 6th data also. I can show you my screen for Whatcom County. It's completely different.
Well, I think he still has Washington State up there.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were putting in Whatcom County's number.
Oh, sorry. It might not have taken here. Let me,
Yeah, it doesn't want to.
yeah, hang on. Here we go, right there.
Right, okay.
There's
So
Whatcom County.
you can see those are very different numbers. We're very close to the
Yeah, you are.
25.
Yeah, that's the point I was going to make, is you are very close to the 25, and the trend is in a downward direction. So I think one of the key questions I would have is that trend going to remain in a downward direction over the coming weeks, or just coming off a holiday weekend, are we going to see what we saw the last 2 holiday weekends, which is cases start to go on the rise again?
Would you do me a favor and would you click over to the healthcare system readiness tab
Healthcare system.
at the very top? Right to the right. Yeah. Because is that still going to be for Whatcom County?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're now meeting that goal, and then it should show you if you click the percent licensed bed occupied by COVID.
Yep.
We've got 174 people in the beds, and we have 2 licensed bed occupied by COVID cases. Yep.
Yep. So
Yeah,
that's-
incredibly useful dashboard. I think everybody needs to take a look at this once a day.
yeah, it's really good. It's really, so again, these are the indicators and the drivers, both for statewide phases, but then they're also overlaid again onto this decision tree that school districts have been provided. You can see in our region, it's not necessarily a common look everywhere. So if we go to Skagit County, it's a different picture. San Juan County, where I just was earlier today over on Friday Harbor, they've had 0 reported cases, new cases over the last 2-week period.
If you look at all of the metrics over time, I've spent a lot of time on this, as you can imagine.
Mhm.
The only one that is consistently failing is the rate over the 2 weeks, which again gets at the total number of people you're testing and contact tracing.
Mhm.
The rest of the things overall, I mean, the reason that we were supposed to go on the system was to flatten the curve, to prove that our healthcare system would not be overwhelmed by new viral testing. And it hasn't, we've proven that is not even relevant all the way back since March. So this whole system of evaluation has been used as a hammer unnecessarily.
Well, yeah.
You can see here as well, another county that's doing well overall is Island County. Of course, they're the only county in our ESD in our 5-county region that managed to make it to phase 3 before phase advancement was suspended. So again, I'm not. These aren't my metrics. I don't set these rules. I'm just here to share that these are the drivers of the public health decisions and the public health recommendations that school districts are being responsive to. And so whether it's right or wrong, if the county health officer in Whatcom County says, I don't think you should be bringing kids back for in-person instruction, that coupled with this data makes it difficult for districts to perhaps make a decision to the contrary. The other factor I would point out as well is, when I was just having this conversation this morning with the new superintendent I was meeting with, is that staff compositions in school districts vary as well. Depending on kind of the nature of your district, you may skew towards a younger staff, you may skew towards an older staff. As an example of an employee class, bus drivers in general tend to skew older as a general rule. And so those are also factors that districts have to consider, which if we did operate school, would we have enough staff available to safely and effectively operate? Or would we be having to accommodate or find alternatives for large numbers of staff who are in high risk categories? And then could we effectively operate without them? So those are other dynamics that districts are wrestling with. Let's see. I stopped sharing that. I thought I had one more thing that might have been of interest to share, but.
Well, I think a couple of things to know is in your audience is Gary Goldfogel, who is, what is your title these days, Gary, on the?
I'm Whatcom County's medical examiner.
And
okay.
and right near him and another questioner was Ken Bell, who is a local port commissioner.
Okay.
And the rest of us important people are Charlie Crabtree, who is a board member on the ESD.
Mm-hmm.
There are other people in the crowd as well. So as you can tell, it's a little frustrating, but this is basically the extent of what we've had to deal with in an ESD environment. Like he says, we're support people and we're ready to do what needs to be done. I think if we're talking the political end of it, which I happen to agree with, is it's more pressure on the local health departments to let people be educated to the differences in testing and the differences in what the dangers are.
Yeah.
And that, we can't do as an ESD, but we can supply what's going on and what it does to our system. And how I for one think it's changed forever how we're going to do public education. I think it's changed forever on those people that are going to choose public education to go to school.
I think we're gonna know pretty quickly some of those impacts. So one of the things that happened last spring is that because of the suddenness of the onset of mandatory school closures and remote learning, school districts were more or less held harmless for the remaining months of the school year. Typically, the way it works in school districts is the first student day of every calendar month from September through June, the district counts up all the students that it currently has enrolled, and then the school district gets funded based on an annual average of those monthly count dates. When school was closed in March, essentially for the remaining months of the year, districts continued to be funded based on what their counts had been prior to closure, and then adjusted for sort of, historical trends of what happens with their enrollment counts in the spring months. Coming back this fall, districts are required now to take daily attendance, and they're only going to be funded based on the students that they can actually demonstrate that they're serving. So for a variety of reasons, I think, Charlie, you've identified some. I think some families have opted for either online or virtual programs outside of the public school system or in a different public school system. Some families may have opted for private school. Some families may just make the decision that remote learning isn't for us, and we're just going to sit it out until kids are back in school in live instruction. But in any case, my expectation is that enrollment sort of across the board in our state is going to be down. It'll probably vary how much it's down district to district, depending on how many different options families may have in particular communities. But that's going to have a significant impact on school districts, and that may have a long-lasting impact. There's no assurance that those families who are opting for a different option may choose to come back when there's a vaccine and it's widely available and it's deemed relatively safe for folks to come back to. So the other thing I'll just add and share, and I just share this as kind of a personal story because it is true in one district in our region, and kind of just to highlight the dilemma that I think superintendents and school boards find themselves in about reopening. But there is a district in our region that is smaller, it's not in Whatcom County, where two spouses of staff members, not staff members themselves, but two spouses of staff members, teachers in the district, have passed away from COVID. That has a real impact to the rest of the staff in that district and their willingness to want to engage more quickly than not in in-person instruction. And whether that ought to be a relevant factor or not, it's a real factor in that those people know and have colleagues who have had spouses die from COVID-19. And so that you know, districts have to respond to that in some way. They have to at least acknowledge that as part of.
Where did those teachers reside that died?
It's in another district in our region, not in Whatcom County, a different district. But I just say that because on these weekly meetings, as I meet with superintendents, that has been shared by that superintendent. They didn't pass away at the same time. One passed and then another about a month later. But, you know, what he was sharing is just kind of the ripple effect that has throughout their staff, right? And how real it becomes when, you know, the potential consequences of this virus, how real it becomes when one of their colleagues and now two of their colleagues have lost spouses to the disease. And that's, you know, that's, again, how that factors in, I think, is probably what's keeping many superintendents and school board members up awake at night, which is, you know, what's an acceptable level of risk that is okay. And I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know that any of them do too, but that's the position that they're in. And when their health authorities are telling them that they strongly recommend they not be engaged in in-person instruction, or certainly have it very, very limited, I think they're doing their best to be responsive to that.
We're running really short on time. Could maybe we open it up, see if anybody else has questions?
Sure.
Go ahead and unmute yourself, Lorraine.
Lorraine Newman. I'm a member of the club, and I also belong to a nonprofit that until March did in-class education in the after-school programs. We're wondering when we can start again. It looks to us like after-school programs won't happen this year, so we are looking at alternative spaces and places where we can start this instruction. So my first question is, when you took those surveys on July 4th, or after July 4th, between parents and teachers about would you be comfortable coming back in school, and you said the majority of people, the majority said they weren't comfortable coming back to school yet. Was that the same for parents and teachers? Neither group wanted to come back to school?
I don't think there's a magic formula around it. My anecdotally, I would say my understanding from the districts, I wasn't doing those surveys, districts were. Okay. Anecdotally, I think it was both.
It was
so kind of prior to that big surge that was, you know, kind of making its way through the South around the 4th of July and the weeks thereafter. Many districts had already done surveying, particularly of their parent community, and depending on the district, it was anywhere from 10 to 30% of families said, it doesn't matter what modality, we want to be in full-on remote learning. And then what happened is that sentiment began to creep up from the 10 to 30% to now a majority of people saying, we don't want to come back. Now, not every district resurveyed, but some did. Okay. And that's what they were discovering.
And then, so the insurers have found that this tree metric, that tree coming out of the health systems, is acceptable to them. As long as as long as you follow the health recommendations on that tree, then they're going to be fine.
I wouldn't want to speak to that for them to say that they found it acceptable. I think what they found it is compelling, right? That this is what the state authorities are saying. This is the framework that they've laid out. Okay. And so this is the basis that we think ought to be the drivers of decisions, because they're not the health authorities either. They're just insurance carriers. I think the point they were making is they weren't passing judgment on whether these were the right metrics or whether this was the right framework. I think what they were saying is if your local health officer is using this framework to make recommendations about whether you should or when you should be having in-person instruction, just know that you're incurring a risk if you deviate,
Deviate from it.
if you deviate from that.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Mhm.
Oh, one more question.
Yeah.
Because they're going to be counting their students now, are people anticipating that there will be a shortfall in funds?
Yes. They are very concerned about that. It's, you know, right now, informally, this is just anecdotally based on because most, in September, you know, not to get too wonky, but in September, the count date occurs on the 4th school day in September for that district. So it's not the same day every month as it is October through June. In September, it's based on when that school district starts, and then the 4th day, that's their count. So every student they've seen to that point. And of the districts who are getting close to or at that date, at least the ones that I've heard from, and I'll hear from more this afternoon when we have our 3 o'clock meeting, they're reporting enrollment down between 5 and 10%, which doesn't sound awful, but if you're a smaller district, 5 or 10% can be pretty significant. Even if you're a larger district, 5 or 10% can be fairly significant because your number one cost is tied up in your employees, and all your teachers and your certificated administrator, all those folks, they all have been issued annual contracts that have to be honored. And that's why, you know, you're seeing the impacts falling to bus drivers, to food service workers, to para-educators. They don't have those annual contracts, and arguably they're not necessarily needed in their current capacity when you're doing remote learning. You're not transporting kids to school. You're not running cafeterias. You're not assisting students on the playground and crossing guards and all of that kind of stuff.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, just making sure. I have a bunch of questions, darn it. I hate to do this, but as a homeschooling parent, something was brought to my attention. I never was even aware that educational service districts existed, for one thing. You know, my kids are actually made it all the way through to college at this point. We have participated in charter schools, online charter schools, and homeschooling. My understanding is these educational service districts actually support charter schools and homeschoolers as well, but this is the first time in my life I've ever even heard of such a thing, and there has so far been no mention made of the services provided by ESD to homeschoolers. So what services exist, and how do you work this out with the health agencies as well, in terms of, you know, making sure that you're not supporting things that the health department, you know, sees as illegal, you know, home gatherings, things like that. I'm just curious. Sorry, I'm rambling.
Yeah, so we don't do a whole lot with homeschooling. Typically, well, I shouldn't say typically, many school districts offer support for their homeschooled families if they want that kind of support. That's typically something that happens at the local school level or the local district level.
Oh, okay. Well, it's interesting because on the website, went to the ESD website, and it does mention support for homeschoolers, and that's why I was puzzled.
Yeah, well, we may do some. We don't do a lot, I will say that. With respect to charter schools, we don't currently have any active charter schools in our region. We're in contact and been in discussions with a couple. So there's one that was set to launch this year in Whatcom County called the Whatcom Intergenerational High School. And we've been in discussions with them about doing their finances, providing technology support, providing support for special needs kids. But they opted not to open this fall, so they're going to swing around a year. So I presume we'll still be, hopefully, still be in partnership with them around that. There's a charter school that approached us, not a charter school, but an organization that approached us in Skagit County that was applying to become a charter school. I think COVID put their plans on hold, but we were having similar conversations with them about what kinds of services and supports we might be able to provide for them on a contractual basis. And then there's another one that's down in the South Snohomish County area. Again, we had been in some preliminary discussions with them. They were another group that was applying to be a charter school or planning to apply to be a charter school prior to the pandemic. And I don't think they've moved forward with their plans at the moment, but hopefully they'll be coming back again the following year. So yeah, I would have to do a little bit more investigating to get clear on when we say we support homeschoolers, what we're doing to support homeschoolers.
Yeah, it was a total surprise to me. I had one other quick question, especially in regards to funding. Now, you say because school enrollments are dropping, that will severely impact school districts. I happen to live in Ferndale School District, which you may know has had some real issues, between the bond and the levy, trying to pass levies on the heels of a very expensive bond, which failed. And now they have lowered the rate and they're hoping to pass it in November. But in the past, what they have said that levy money covers is things not covered by the state, what they refer to as enrichment, that is athletic programs, music, things like that, after school kinds of stuff. Is it ethical for them to continue to collect levy money if they are not providing services, for example, as I say, football programs? And, can they just collect and pocket that, or do they have to spend it on enrichment? What's the, Yeah,
you're asking a question we could probably sit and mull around for several hours, but whether it's ethical or not, I would say that most districts, even though levies, when the legislature implemented the McCleary fix a couple of years ago to respond to the lawsuit that they weren't appropriately funding basic ed, local levies, the legislature changed the name to enrichment levies, and I believe they did that so that they could insulate themselves from future accusations that they aren't fully funding basic education. But I would say more so than athletic programs, music programs, drama programs, districts hire more staff than the state funds with those resources. The transportation formula, which could be another all weekend seminar as to how that works, by and large in most districts doesn't fully fund the cost of districts transporting students. Now, some of that is based on district choice of how they choose to transport students, and the formula doesn't support all of those services they want to provide. So to the extent that they're doing anything beyond what the state funds, it's now considered enrichment. But it's well beyond, in most districts, what you would think of as the football team or the drill team or the track team. It's heavily invested in staff that are just providing an enriched level of service beyond what the state funds.
Okay. Is there because with the reduction in number of students, there also has to be somewhat of a reduction in the amount of services necessary, for example, in transportation and whatnot. Yep. So where can the average Joe go to get information on what the bottom line is, how much schools are saving with the reduction in students versus how much more they're spending because of, situations they hadn't anticipated, such as, the online learning stuff. Where do you get the information on that?
Well, there's all kinds of information available on the OSPI website that speaks to the apportionment of the funding that districts are receiving, and there's monthly reports that are on there. But where it's impacting the bottom line of the district is going to be a district by district scenario. I mean, it's depending on how much belt tightening has the district done at this point. Have they chosen to lay off, say, their transportation drivers versus furlough them? So there are all kinds of individual choices that districts can make that are going to influence how they're, what the bottom line is going to end up looking like with respect to their funding. I'll just say with the transportation, and this is really, really wonky, but the way the formula works is it looks primarily in the rear view mirror, right? So because districts were transporting students last year, they are going to receive transportation funding this fall when most of them will not be transporting students or will not be transporting large numbers of students. And then as we get into winter and the spring, their transportation funding becomes more dependent on the numbers of students that they were transporting in the fall. And so this is going to potentially be this weird scenario where when districts aren't transporting students, they're actually going to get transportation funding. And hopefully by the time districts start transporting students again in significant numbers as we get farther into the year, they may not be qualifying for transportation funding because they weren't transporting students in the fall. So there's, you know, I mean, I could go on and on. I mean, this is just the wonky nature of how school is funded, but that's a real example of what districts are struggling with right now, which is I'm going to have funding when I don't need it, and I'm potentially not going to have funding when I do need it.
Okay, is that funding transferable to other areas of spending then, or is it earmarked for transportation?
It's earmarked for transportation. So if districts do not spend their transportation funding on allowable transportation expenditures, they will be subject to recovery at the end of the year. Yep.
All right, thank
How
you.
about one last question, and then I need to bring it to a close because we're over time.
Oh,
Yep.
sorry.
That's okay. Terry, did you have another question? Or Lorraine, somebody had a question. Did I miss? You have to unmute if you
Yeah,
do.
I'm sorry, I was muted. Yeah, it's not really a question, except that it's evident when I listen to everything that has gone into the decisions that the health directors cannot be challenged. And now they have the insurance agents on their side because their lawyers are telling them you can't do anything different than what the health directors tell you. And essentially no risk or no risk on any level appears to be the only thing that's acceptable. And those are the things that really concern me.
Yeah, I think, well, so just two things. There's three people who can close a school district. There's the governor, there's the local health officer, and there's the superintendent. Those are the three individuals who can make a decision to close the district. And the health officer is an important player. Now, there's only one county I'm aware of where the health officer has actually taken a stand and said and mandated that schools will not open to in-person instruction, and that's in Pierce County. All the other health officers have simply stated it as recommendations. The dilemma districts find themselves in, and kind of circling back to their insurance carriers, and not to make too much of this, but it is a significant factor, is if you're deviating from that and something bad happens to someone, a reasonable argument could be made that you should have known that that was a potential of what could have happened, and you were being advised by your county health officer, who has the authority to close your schools, to do something different, and you chose not to do that. So, you know, school boards and they also have a fiduciary responsibility to their communities. They have a responsibility not to put the district in a potentially libelous situation where they may forfeit their insurance coverage. So that, you know, they wrestle with that as well.
And Larry, I understand all that, and I understand that you don't make these decisions, but I mean, this whole lockdown now is at a point where people have had enough,
Yeah.
and nobody knows how to get past it.
Let me give you a final example, and I'm going to bring it to a close. You know, we're in this race for a vaccine, right? And yesterday there was one adverse reaction reported in England, and it brought one of the major vaccine trials to a complete halt. All we need is one person that has some sort of a claim of an adverse reaction. You don't even know if they're in the placebo group or in the real group, and now all of a sudden the vaccine thing is to a halt. Just anticipate that the idea that we're going to have widespread vaccine by the end of the year is a complete fallacy. It's never going to happen, and it's going to be for exactly the same reason. We don't have tort reform. We don't have tort protection against
Right.
the manufacturing. So we're not going to get out of this crisis by a vaccine. We're not going to get out of it by common sense. And, you know, and it seems at the moment we're not going to get out of it by politics. But anyway, excellent, Larry. We really appreciate your program.
Sure, I'm happy to spend time with you today.
I need to bring this to a close. Thank you all that participated today. I'm sorry it's a small group, but you know, we're bringing you great programs and we'll continue to do so.
And I think
You're
somebody
always
asked,
welcome to join us.
somebody asked if they had another question but didn't want to ask it because of time. So I put my email address in there, so please feel free to contact me.
Excellent. And I also put the COVID dashboard URL on there as well. But if you just Google Whatcom COVID dashboard, you'll also get it.
Can we
Thank you
say
very
thank
much.
you
And
to
everybody,
Larry?
what's that?
Can we say thank you to Larry?
Absolutely. Say thank you, Larry.
All right, you bet.
Thank
I
you.
did not get the email. Could
Oh.
you resend it?
Sorry, I think I ended up sending it privately. So I will put it in here for everyone.
Put it in the chat. It's perfect.
All right, there you go.
Thank you.
Okay, you bet.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, have a great afternoon, everyone.